By the end of 1862, the war dragged on for almost 2 years, fighting in the east in Virginia, a little bit of Maryland, fighting in the west in Tennessee and along the Mississippi River. And, people now knew it would be the longest and costliest war in American history. No longer did people expect an easy or quick victory. As this realization slowly dawned, 1861 and 1862 passed, it had tremendous implications for policy, and that's going to be the focus of this short video. One example is the simple fact that the armies needed more men. This would, of course, lead to the beginnings of conscripted service, a draft for both sides. Shown here is a letter informing its recipient that he'd been drafted. The Confederacy was the first to implement a draft. It was, in a sense, ironic and controversial. I say ironic, of course, because the federal draft was the ultimate in federal authority, and it was supposedly a nation dedicated to states' rights. The irony wasn't lost on a number of leading Confederate politicians who argued that it was contrary to the goals of the Confederacy was fighting for. It was however necessary. Robert E. Lee was the first general to say more manpower would be needed and advised Jefferson Davis to propose a conscription law in the Confederate Congress. Jefferson Davis agreed to it. In April 1862, the Confederate Congress passed its first draft law. It required all able-bodied white males, including those whose volunteer enlistments were ending, between the ages of 18 and 35 to register for draft. If drafted, they would serve for 3 years. The law did exempt several groups: clergy, civil servants, militia officers, druggists, and teachers. And as a result of the last two exceptions, a number of drugstores and schools opened. This first draft law proved inadequate. In October 1862, a few months later, the Congress passed another tougher draft law. Now the only exemption was, one white man per plantation with 20 or more slaves. Obviously, that was necessary to keep order and business in the slave plantations, which are key to the Southern economy. The North saw the irony and kind of mocked the South. Below is a Northern cartoon lampooning the draft. Here's another Northern cartoon talking about Southern volunteers, obviously conscripted. They argued that the people in the South didn't want to fight and the government was forcing them. It was tyrannical. The new law did allow drafted men to hire proxies to serve in their place. By the end of 1862, the price of a proxy had risen to $6,000 in Confederate currency, or $300 in gold. The new law, however, also expanded the upper limit from 35 years to 45 years. Very late in the war, in 1864 I should add, the Confederate Congress bumped the ages from 17 to 50 and repealed the proxy provisions. They were obviously getting very desperate by that point. The proxy process angered a lot of people, as did the large plantation exemption. People began to argue as the war dragged on that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. In any event, as I say, the Confederate drafts were obviously necessary. Had there not been an early draft in 1862, the South probably would not have been able to maintain an effective army by the end of the year. The figures are estimates, but approximately 120,000 people were drafted into the Confederate Army, and an additional 70,000 people paid for proxies. With its larger manpower reserves, the North was a little slower to result to a draft. But not that much slower. It first began to considering it by the fall of 1862. Not as desperate as the South, by the end of 1862, the Union draft law was actually adopted in early 1863 and had as its real purpose raising volunteers. Each congressional district was given a quota of men. If the quota was not met, then a draft resulted. County and city leaders worked hard to get volunteers to, because they thought it was embarrassing if they didn't meet the local quota, and it was a disgrace. And so they would say, look, man, you're going to be drafted anyway. You might as well join up and have a little honor. Here's a U.S. draft poster, and you can note the emphasis on volunteers to avoid a draft. One way the county and city leaders began to try to get volunteers was by offering a bounty. As the war progressed and potential recruits dwindled, the bounty, of course, kept getting higher and higher. Wealthy districts enticed men from poor districts. When state and even the federal government got into the business later of paying bounties, it made big business. There were bounty brokers and a lot of fraud. In the end, the total amount paid by all levels probably exceeded $1 billion paid in bounties. Unlike the Confederate draft, the Union draft had no occupation exemptions, only medical and family related, but it did provide for buying proxies just like the South did. To keep the price from rising to astronomical levels, as it had in the South, the Union also allowed a person drafted to pay a $300 fee and get out of that particular draft. If another draft were called, they would have to be eligible for that again. The bounty and the proxy system again led to charges among the poor that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. In the end, the Union drafted 46,000 men, while another 118,000 furnished substitutes or proxies. While some have said that the law shows that the draft was a failure, such a view fails to consider that its real purpose was to stimulate volunteers, which obviously it did. The idea that it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight continued to grow. In fact, a little bit later, after the end of 1862 and 1863, there were actually draft riots in New York City. Bands of poor Irish Catholics burned and looted the city. Order was restored, but it did contribute to continued unrest throughout the rest of the war. Anti-war sentiment began to die down, as the victories came in later on when the North appeared to be winning. But by the end of 1862, the anti-war sentiment was obviously still very high in the North. I should add that by the end of 1862, Britain and other European countries officially remained neutral, and they'd yet to aid the South, and that's in spite of Britain needing Southern cotton. With the Union victory at Antietam and the Union progress in the Western Theater, however, there's little chance now that any nation would become involved. Shown here is a cartoon depicting Americans discussing with Europe. The United States told Europe that if anybody helped the South, then they're going to war with the United States, and nobody wanted to do that, obviously. Another result of the long, prolonged fighting in 1861 and 1862 was even more significant. It was a major shift in policy in the war. It was Lincoln's decision to move towards emancipation. Lincoln had earlier in the war rejected the idea of emancipation. Keep in mind that he was a Republican, and the GOP's platform was simply prohibiting expansion of slaves westward into the territory. He feared that if he would emancipate the slaves, it would drive the slave-owning but loyal border states into the Confederacy. He explained his thinking in a letter to the abolitionist Horace Greeley early in 1862. Quote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union," unquote. And you can see a published copy of the letter here. But that demonstrates that Lincoln was no abolitionist and primarily concerned about preserving the Union. Gradually, by the summer of 1862, Lincoln's views were beginning to change. And there are a number of reasons for that listed here. First, the war was so bloody, not letting the larger issue be settled, might be a missed opportunity. He'd hate to see another, civil war in the distant future to determine about the remaining slaves. So, that was a major consideration. He also, lesser consideration, but realized that if he issued an Emancipation Proclamation, it would probably assure that no country would decide to aid the South in the future. The U.S. would gain international public opinion. Another big reason was by issuing some emancipation, what that would do, it would hurt the South's war efforts. It would encourage slaves to rise up and rebel. And if that happened, obviously slave owners would leave the battlefield and go back and put down their rebellion. And finally, keep in mind that Lincoln was a politician. The 1864 elections were approaching, and the abolitionists were gaining political power. coming out for emancipation would mean no challenge for the Republican nomination from abolitionists who weren't pleased with them. And it would assure a united front politically for the general campaign. So Lincoln's thinking began to shift as 1862 passed. Just after the Battle of Antietam, which we've talked about before, that bloody battle mentioned in previous videos, Lincoln figured the time was ripe. And he decided to issue a preliminary proclamation, which came out on September 22nd, 1862, just before the November congressional elections. The proclamation said that if the South would lay down their arms by January 1st, 1862, then there wouldn't be any emancipation. But if they didn't, the slaves would be free after January 1st, 1863. The opponents, Lincoln's political opponents, tried to use fear in that congressional election. They attacked it and said that Lincoln was turning it into a war to fight for blacks, and that wasn't what they'd signed up for and all of that. But Lincoln figured, like I say, that it would embolden abolitionists who might determine the presidential election in 2 years. Indeed, when it came to that election, the Republicans lost some seats. They lost 32 seats in the House, which you can see here, and several governorships, which seems to suggest that issuing that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was a mistake politically. But in another sense, however, the fear tactic, that the opponents of it didn't work. Like I say, the abolitionists were ecstatic, and they came out hard for Lincoln in 1864. And you got to keep in mind that the party in power usually loses seats in all of your congressional elections, and 32 seats may seem like a lot, but actually it was pretty light. So Lincoln was pleased that he'd issued that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In any event, perhaps, of course, the South did not lay down their arms by January 1st, 1863. So on that date, Lincoln signed the official Emancipation Proclamation, shown here. I should be clear here. The Emancipation Proclamation did not abolish slavery in the United States. It did not end slavery everywhere. It freed the slaves only in those areas still rebelling. So it did not free slaves in the border slave states still loyal to the Union. And theoretically, it could mean that slaves in areas already conquered by Northern troops would not be freed. But, regardless, it was still big news and hugely important. The war to save the Union was evolving into a war to end slavery, and that can't be underestimated. It also, of course, assured Lincoln's historical legacy, especially after he was assassinated. He is forever going to be known as the Great Emancipator. In any event, that concludes the video on the way some policies were changing and as the war dragged on through 1861, 1862, talking about the draft and about the Emancipation Proclamation.